Marshal João Batista Mascarenhas de Moraes, do you really know the commander of the Brazilian Expeditionary Force? Because the Brazilian army in Brazil, throughout their existence, have had great figures who shaped their military history. In the 19th century, it was certainly the Duke of Caxias, but in the 20th century, no frontline commander stood out more than Mascarenhas de Moraes, but almost nothing is known about the beginning of Mascarenhas' military career, as is the case today. Here in the War Room, you're about to learn about it. The small city of São Gabriel, located in the southern part of the state of Rio Grande do Sul, was at the end of the 19th century a region marked by war. As a vanguard garrison during the military crises of the Rio de la Plata, it was also the scene of extensive Imperial Army troop activity during the Paraguayan War. After the Great Conflict, it became the headquarters of the 1st Horse Artillery Regiment, popularly known as the Unit, commanded by Marshal Emilio Malay and renowned for its role in the Battle of Tuiuti. In São Gabriel lived the couple Lafayette Apolinário de Moraes and Manuela Mascarenhas de Moraes. He, a merchant, and she, the daughter of a traditional local farmer, had 4 sons and 1 daughter. Their youngest, born on November 13, 1883, was a lively boy, baptized João Batista. Mascarenhas de Moraes, the Mascarenhas de Moraes family, did not come from a great military tradition. But little João Batista, from an early age, grew up immersed in army life, witnessing the constant parades, ceremonies, and troop movements as they passed through the city with their impressive horse-drawn howitzers. But the ghost of war that surrounded São Gabriel returned to haunt, to terrify the city at the beginning of 1893, when Mascarenhas was still 9 years old. Armed groups opposed to the governor of Rio Grande do Sul, Julio de Castilhos, began revolutionary actions to overthrow the government and change the federal constitution. That was the Federalist Revolution. A conflict marked by extreme violence that spread the practice of beheading prisoners throughout the entire southern region of Brazil. And, as the conflict was about to reach São Gabriel, the Mascarenhas family hurriedly fled, leaving all their belongings behind and taking refuge in Porto Alegre. The family's finances quickly suffered the consequences, while Lafayette became a traveling salesman throughout the interior of the state. Manuela opened a small bakery, where little João Batista helped her make and deliver the bread. The Federalist Revolution was defeated in 1895, but the Mascarenhas family chose to be cautious and only returned to São Gabriel in 1898. At this point, João Batista was 14 years old, and already employed and studying in Porto Alegre, he stayed behind alone in the capital. There, he had his future planned out. He was studying at a good school, preparing intensely to take the entrance exam for the military school of Rio Pardo, one of the institutions that provided access to becoming an officer in the Brazilian army. His effort paid off on April 1, 1899, when at the age of 15, he enlisted as a student in Rio Pardo, taking the first step in his long military career. Alongside other young men like Bertoldo Klinger, the future commander of the 1932 Constitutionalist Revolution, Mascarenhas, from an early age stood out. He proved to be a dedicated and serious student, standing out for his grades in his class, although he acknowledged that military education in Rio Pardo could be improved in many aspects. In his second year at the school, he was now a veteran among a new class of freshmen, which included the young student Getulio Vargas. As expected, at the beginning of 1902, the student Mascarenhas de Moraes graduated as one of the top students in his class in Rio Pardo. He immediately transferred to Rio de Janeiro, where, in March of the same year, he entered the Military School of Brazil, located at Praia Vermelha. Amidst his study routine, Cadet Mascarenhas noticed at Praia Vermelha that his classmates easily shifted their interest from military subjects to politics and philosophy, venturing into what he saw as a departure from the military's role. The location of the military school, right in the heart of Rio de Janeiro, really exposed the cadet to all the turmoil of Rio society. This characteristic had already heavily influenced national history and would continue to do so in the following decades. Unlike most of his classmates, Mascarenhas focused solely on his military career. He had realized early on that he had the responsibility to help his parents financially, and his childhood, marked by the violence of the revolution that had caused so much harm to his family, instilled in him an unshakable belief in legality, and this set of values would soon be put to the test. In 1904, Oswaldo Cruz, Director of Public Health in Rio de Janeiro, proposed to the government the introduction of mandatory vaccination for the population. To contain the various epidemics that were quickly spreading through the capital and the country, positivist groups, including military officers, then led the opposition to the new law. And among the rebels were the cadets from the Praia Vermelha Military School. On November 14, 1904, the vaccine revolt broke out, and on that day, the cadets deposed the commander of the school. And, supported by politicians and military personnel, they marched against the Catete Palace. Some refused to take part in the revolt, and one of them was Juan Batista Mascarenhas de Moraes. However, the rebellious group, confronted by a body of loyalist troops on their way to the palace, suffered a bloody defeat. The cadets' insurrection was the last straw for the Ministry of War. The Praia Vermelha Military School was closed, and after an investigation that confirmed Mascarenhas' innocence, he was assigned to serve with the 23rd Infantry Battalion, also in Rio de Janeiro. There, despite having been a cadet, Mascarenhas held the rank of soldier. He began serving under the strict supervision of Sergeant Fontoura, an extremely harsh man but an expert in the profession of arms, who demanded meticulous precision in the cleaning and maintenance of weapons. With Fontoura, the young Mascarenhas learned valuable lessons about the profession he aspired to, and when he was finally promoted to student ensign in August 1905, the first person he hugged out of happiness was his strict sergeant. To his delight, his first post after being declared an artillery ensign was with the 1st Field Artillery Regiment, the new designation of the Boa de Botas, precisely in his hometown of São Gabriel, finally able to see his family and childhood home again after 12 long years. The regiment commander, Colonel Belo Augusto Brandão, quickly took a liking to the young man and the diligent ensign, introducing Mascarenhas to his family. And at the commander's house, the ensign saw for the first time the young Ada Brandão, the colonel's daughter, a young woman who would later become his wife, promoted to second lieutenant in January 1905. Shortly after, Mascarenhas was invited by a friend to join the Brazil-Bolivia Border Commission, an agency created after the signing of the Treaty of Petrópolis in 1903, which redrew the border between the two countries, with the cession of Acre to Brazil and of territories from Mato Grosso to Bolivia. It was necessary, therefore, to carry out a complete topographic survey of the new borders, and Mascarenhas accepted the job to double his salary and better support his family. On July 4th of that year, Lieutenant Mascarenhas set out for Mato Grosso as an assistant to the small commission of Army and Navy officers, as well as civilian officials, who set sail from Rio de Janeiro for the long sea and river journey to the distant city of Corumbá. After more than 2 months of travel, passing along the coasts of Uruguay, Argentina, and Paraguay, the commission reached its destination on August 9th. For the next 6 months, Mascarenhas assisted the Brazilian and Bolivian commissioners in marking the geographic coordinates of various points along the new border near Corumbá, until he returned to Rio de Janeiro in February 1908. Back in the capital, he was enrolled at the Artillery and Engineering School of Realengo, where he remained for the next 2 years, taking part in the construction of the modern Copacabana fort until he was promoted to first lieutenant in June 1910. In the meantime, his name had been proposed for a new position on the Boundary Commission with Bolivia, this time in the new territory of Acre, in the heart of the Amazon rainforest. In August 1910, Mascarenhas rejoined as an assistant to the commission. He quickly set sail for Manaus and arrived in the capital of Amazonas at the height of the first rubber boom, when the city displayed the luxuries that its prosperous export economy had brought. The Brazilian Commission then waited for the arrival of its Bolivian counterpart, which docked in Manaus in February 1911, composed of a military leadership and hired English engineers. The Bolivian Commission set out, together with the Brazilian one, for the Acre rainforest on April 1812, taking more than a month in the slow journey through rivers and streams until reaching the starting point of the work in the locality now known as Brasileia. From there, the expedition set out, slowly making its way along the banks of the rivers that separated the countries, in a routine that included both daytime and nighttime work, constantly stopping to take readings with the compass and Austrian Starkey and Carlson level gauges, as well as with sextants and telescopes. Hunting provided a good part of the expedition members' food, and together with a doctor who accompanied them, Mascarenhas took the lead as the person responsible for maintaining the group's health. He insisted strictly on the daily intake of quinine pills, which ended up ensuring a scarce record of tropical diseases among the members. The first expedition, which ended in 1912, was marked by the experience gained by the men who entered the forest as novices, and 6 months later emerged as veterans. This enabled the 1912 expedition, the longest of the 4 that Mascarenhas undertook in the Amazon, to map a record distance of 300 kilometers, with the men moving with a skill they never expected to have the previous year. During this expedition, Mascarenhas, who always insisted on camping far from villages to avoid mosquitoes carrying malaria, ended up having to seek help at the small property of a riverside family. Being warmly welcomed and waiting for lunch, the father of the family confided to the group that a hawk tormented him daily, coming to attack his chickens. Mascarenhas then promised to solve the problem for him. At the time when the bird usually appeared, Mascarenhas took his rifle and sat on the ground, aiming it at the area the resident had pointed out to him. And, without much delay, on top of a tree, the said bird appeared. Fixing his gaze on the hawk, he placed it in the center of his sights, and, with a precise shot that echoed through the forest, he brought down the bird of prey, provoking a wave of cheers from everyone who was watching. After the long expedition, the return to Manaus in October 1912 was followed by Mascarenhas' trip to Europe, a destination at that time less distant than Rio Grande do Sul. Since passenger ships sailed directly from Manaus to Lisbon and from Portugal, he extended his trip to England, visiting London at the invitation of the British engineers from the Bolivian Commission, who were now his friends. Back in the jungle, the Commission began its 3rd expedition with the help of a revolutionary technology, radiotelegraphy. Setting out with a radio listening station, the Commission picked up signals from an astronomical station set up in Porto Velho, which transmitted precise longitude data. Periodically, this innovation dramatically accelerated the pace of work, and what used to take more than half a year was accomplished in less than 2 months at the border. It was during the last days of this expedition, on November 13, that while resting in a hammock in the middle of the forest, Mascarenhas realized that on that date he was celebrating his 30th birthday, and suddenly he realized that it was about time to start his own family. On his last expedition, in 1914, it was Mascarenhas' responsibility to carry out the topographic survey of the Madeira River. From the confluence of the Madeira and Mamoré rivers, in Vila Murtinho heading north, to the mouth of the Abuna River. The commission returned to Manaus on September 18 of that year, after 68 days in the jungle, having completed the magnificent work of demarcating about 600 kilometers of borders between Brazil and Bolivia in Europe. The outbreak of the First World War had happened that July, and it coincided with Lieutenant Mascarenhas' return to the federal capital, where he received his first post in a combat unit. As a commissioned officer, in January 1915, he was assigned to the 1st Mounted Artillery Regiment stationed at the military village in Rio de Janeiro, an organization that would become a central part of his future violent career. But for now, Mascarenhas would fulfill another of his aspirations. On August 4, 1915, he married his fiancée Ada, beginning a long union that would last forever. The following year, his first son Roberto was born, and in 1919, the couple welcomed their daughter, Marta. But while this was happening, the whirlwind of 20th century Brazilian military history would sweep João Batista's life away. Mascarenhas de Moraes promised you that Mascarenhas' story was fantastic, and it continues in the following decades. Even more interesting, but while that video isn't out yet, come study with us in our course Brazil in World War II, which will teach you all this and much more. It's everything you need to teach, to research, to write, in short, to know much more about this very important period in our history. Classes start on May 26th, and I'll be waiting for you there.